There's playing the major scale, and then there's truly understanding the major scale. Take the C major scale, and we have a pool of notes which we can run up and down. And I would call that a very basic understanding of the scale. Having good left and right hand technique to play that scale, to play it cleanly is all important. But that is a very superficial grasp of the scale when it comes to applying it musically. Because to be able to create musical phrases with that scale, we need to understand how the pitches typically work. For instance, some notes are more prominently used than others. Some have very specific roles and functions. Now, what are they, and how can understanding this help us create musical phrases in a jazz context with the major scale? And in this lesson, I want to show you what I think those functions are and how this can help you create your own musical ideas. First off, let's make sure that we know the notes of the scale, we can play it, and we know the intervals too. So let's take one octave position of the C major scale. So starting on the G string, we've got C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And in terms of intervals, it's as follows. So C's our root or tonic, D's a major second, E's a major third, F is a perfect fourth, G's a perfect fifth, A's our major sixth, B's our major seven, and we're back to where we started, but an octave higher, back to the root. We're then going to split those notes out into two camps. We're going to have a group of primary notes and a group of secondary notes. So the primary notes are the first, third, and fifth of the scale. The notes which give us the notes of a C chord. That's a C major triad there, so 1, 3, 5, back to the 1. So that's C, E, G, C. So those are our most important notes. The secondary notes are the remaining notes. So D, the second, F the fourth, A the sixth, and B the seventh. So I now have the sound of a C chord sustained in the background, and let's think about the specific function of some of these notes. So looking at the primary notes first, that was C, E, G, the root, the third, and the fifth. What those notes do is they sound individually the notes of the chord. So they help say to the listener, it's a C chord. Reinforces the harmony of the song if you were playing over a C chord. Now if I just improvise with these. So it sounds strong, all those notes, they don't clash, they all sound consonants, they sound in tune with that. They say the chord. So if it's a C chord, those are notes that you want to place prominently. And by prominently, I mean either, starting them on them or finishing them, or, if you had a phrase, it might be predominantly made up of primary notes so that it says the sound of the chord. Moving on to secondary notes. So the D, what does that sound like against this chord? Well, it's the second. It needs to do something. It's sat between two primary notes, the C and the E. So for me, the second is desperate to either go back down to the root or up to the third. So it's a nice way to connect the root and the third either way. So I could do E, D, C, which is primary, secondary, primary. The other way, C, D, E. That's D, E, C, do, da, da. The other way around. That all works. Now let's finish on the D and see what it sounds like. Unfinished business, it feels like to me. Needs to either go or. So it needs to finish on a primary note. Then the next primary note sits between the third and the fifth, sits again between two primary notes. It's F. Listen to that again. If I play three primary notes and then finish on that, it's quite tense against that. So again, it probably wants to go like a suspended fourth down to the third, so F to E, or up to the fifth. That's F, G, E, C. Then the next secondary note was A. I think that sounds less dissonant than the last one. It sounds nice and sweet, I think, the sixth. So for me, down to the fifth. Or up to the root. We got the seventh as our next one, the major seventh, which sounds a bit more intense, nice jazzy sound. a bit more complex sound than some of the other secondary notes. Where's that desperate to go? It's the leading note. I'm sure you can hear it wants to go back up to C to resolve. So you have this mixture of notes which work well. Well, they all work well, I suppose, but it's this idea that where you place them, like you wouldn't want to finish maybe on the fourth. You know, if I had a phrase, it needs to go down to the third or up to the fifth to finish off on a primary note. So those secondary notes, you use them for adding colour and interest, but they do create tension. So, you know, unless you deliberately want to play to that, you know, try to finish on a primary note. Now, if I deliberately play with loads of secondary notes, you'll see that it doesn't work with the chord. So I'm missing all the primary. Now if I add some primary back in, you can hear that then that kind of is working better. So a little takeaway there is place the primary notes 1, 3 and 5 prominently, either, you know, rhythmically or where they finish or end up in the phrase. Those notes help you speak the sound of the chord and will give you a good connection with playing over the track you're playing over or the chords you're playing over if you're playing with someone else. And those secondary notes are there for additional colour. They're also there for me to link between those primary notes like we were doing earlier. Now you could just go straight from the root to the third, but you've got the second in between. How many melodies do you know made up with, you know, root, second and third? Such a common melodic movement. Same with between the third and the fifth, that fourth. And between the fifth and the root again, we got that there. And what we're starting to do is we're starting to move away from the idea of a scale being a collection of notes, and instead move into, yes, it is a collection of notes, but it's about how those notes are used and the kind of function of them, with 1, 3, 5 speaking the sound of the chord, and the secondary notes bringing in colour, but also helping us create nice movements between the primary notes. So you can think of some notes sounding the chords, other notes, things like the second, as a way to move down to the, you know, wanting to move down to the root or up to the third. When you hear people improvise with the major scale, often they might be thinking of the sounds of the major scale, but they're bringing in other things too. And what else can you bring in? It's the remaining notes of our 12-tone system, so the chromatic notes. So if we filled out the gaps between the secondary and primary notes, we'd have this. So the chromatic scale. Now, what you can do is you can bring in those chromatic notes for colours and again for movement between primary notes, or to make the move from a secondary note to a primary note kind of feel more, have more momentum. Say for instance, if we fill the gap between C and D, particularly going down, so going from the second down to the root, and playing the C sharp in between the two, so going D, C sharp, C. Fill the gap between the second and third, back down to the root. Between the third and the fifth, we have the F sharp. You can hear we're now getting jazzier phrases, like that phrase. So that starts on F sharp up to a G, so that's a chromatic note into a primary note, down to another primary note, down to a primary note, up to a secondary note for colour, finishing on a primary note. So again, the primary notes are placed prominently, and we've got, you know, C, E, G there, those 3 primary notes, plus an F sharp, a chromatic note, and D, a secondary note. It will really depend on where you're at in terms of your journey with improvising and using the major scale, but I think it's, you know, not uncommon for us guitarists to have a period where we can play scales and it's kind of like, how does this ever become music? And we don't really maybe delve into details like this. We might learn licks from it without this kind of understanding that, oh, okay, so a lot of these licks and vocabulary works because of this, because of the way that the interplay between primary and secondary notes and then chromatics as well. When you analyse a lot of solos, and this is why it's good to do transcription or to analyse other people's solos, you often realise that, wow, those primary notes are just so super common. and how they, you know, hold everything together and enable the harmony to shine through in the soloist playing. So having a good grasp of all this kind of thing is very important to me. My next two videos will cover similar topics on the major scale in kind of go into ideas of how to get more from this scale and to think about it differently. And I'll put a link in the description to my ebook on practicing the major scale for jazz guitar as well. So have a look at that over at my website. If you have any questions or comments on today's lesson, then please leave them below. If you're new here, my name's Andy. Join me for jazz guitar lessons every Wednesday and Saturday. Until next time, you take care.